I'm 72 years old now, and it took me a long time to understand that what they called normal in my life was never really normal. For decades, I accepted ready-made explanations because I didn't know there was any other option than to believe. I kept repeating to myself that it was just like that all families had their silences, that certain things simply shouldn't be said out loud. It was easier to agree than to face the discomfort of thinking differently, and I learned early on that questioning was too costly. For most of my life, I was told that being silent was a sign of maturity. That good people don't create problems, don't ask difficult questions, don't bring unpleasant subjects to the table. I heard this so many times that I started to confuse silence with virtue. I believed that swallowing what hurt was a form of love, and that enduring without complaining was what was expected of me. Today, looking back, I realize how much this idea shaped who I became. I lived for many years believing that what I felt was not important enough to be said. There was always someone with bigger problems, someone who needed more attention, someone who couldn't be contradicted. So I adjusted, diminished myself, convinced myself that everything was fine. This habit of putting myself in second place was not born with me, it was taught with patience, repetition, and fear. And, over time, it became part of my identity. When I think about it now, I see how much I have been trained to doubt myself. If something bothered me, I learned to think it was overkill. If something hurt me, I wondered if I wasn't being too sensitive. This internal confusion accompanied me for decades, silent, constant, heavy. No one needed to tell me to be quiet anymore, because I was already doing it alone, almost automatically, without realizing the emotional cost of it. I spent a good part of my life believing that protecting others meant keeping silent, that maintaining harmony was more important than telling the truth. And I did it with dedication. I smiled when I wanted to cry, I agreed when I wanted to disagree, I stayed when I wanted to leave. All in the name of a peace that was never truly mine. A peace that always demanded my sacrifice and my silence. Today, at 72, I understand something that took a lifetime to become clear. The silence they taught me did not save me. He didn't protect me, he didn't strengthen me, he didn't give me peace. He just erased me little by little, day after day, choice after choice. And that's why I'm telling this story now. Because there comes a time when being silent hurts more than talking. The fact that you chose to stay here and hear this says a lot about who you are. What comes next isn't just my story, it's something that many people have lived in silence for far too long. If you believe that these truths deserve to be told and preserved, subscribe to the channel, because supporting these stories is the only way to ensure that they continue to exist. When I was younger, no one used harsh words to tell me to shut up. Everything was wrapped up in care, in advice that sounded kind, in warnings said in a low voice. They said it was for my good, that certain things didn't need to be said, that exposing feelings would only bring confusion. I learned to associate love with restraint, as if talking was a threat to the order of things. At that time, I didn't have the vocabulary to question it, I just absorbed it. Silence was presented as a sign of respect. Respect for the elderly, for the family, for the image we needed to maintain in front of others. If something bothered me, the answer came quickly, it's not worth messing with it, let it go, forget it. And I obeyed. Because I wanted to be seen as someone good, correct, easy to deal with. I didn't want to be the problem, nor the cause of discomfort in an environment where there was already enough tension. Over the years, this idea solidified within me. I truly believed that to love was to endure in silence. That showing discomfort was selfish. That talking about what hurt was a form of weakness. So I policed myself all the time, carefully choosing what could and couldn't come out of my mouth. Often, what remained was precisely what needed to be said the most. There were times when I felt like asking, to better understand certain attitudes, certain decisions that affected me directly. But even before I opened my mouth, I was already convinced that it wasn't necessary. I myself repeated the phrases I heard so many times, as if they were absolute truths. It was impressive how silence was no longer imposed and became an automatic, almost invisible choice. This kind of silent love exacts a heavy price, although no one talks about it. On the outside, I seemed calm, understanding, strong. Inside, there was a constant confusion between what I felt and what I thought I should feel. I got used to ignoring my own limits, believing that this was maturity. And the more I kept silent, the harder it became to recognize who I really was. Today, looking back, I realize that silence was never neutral. He always favored someone, and it was almost never me. But at the time, all I knew was that being loved meant not talking too much, not questioning, not insisting. And so, little by little, I learned to disappear into what they called love. I grew up in a simple house, one of those where everything seemed normal in the eyes of those who passed by on the street. There was no luxury or great faults, just the essentials to move forward. The walls kept more silence than conversation, and the days followed a predictable, almost rigid routine. From an early age, I learned that inside we didn't talk about feelings, we only fulfilled tasks and expectations. It was a house where what was not said seemed more important than any words. My family placed a high value on the appearance of order. Not order in the sense of cleanliness only, but of behavior. Each one knew what his place was, and leaving it caused discomfort. My parents were not cruel people, but they were not open either. There was affection, yes, but always accompanied by invisible limits. I felt that there were forbidden subjects, even though no one ever listed them clearly for me. In the relationship with my parents, I learned more by observing than by talking. The looks told me when I should stop, when it wasn't time to ask, when it was better to swallow my curiosity. I don't remember long conversations about what I felt or thought. The important thing was to obey, help, and not give trouble. I understood very early on that pleasing was a form of security inside that house. Financially, we never had much, but we also never went through extreme needs. This reinforced the idea that I had no reason to complain. After all, I had a roof, food, and family. Whenever something bothered me, I remembered it myself and thought it would be ingratitude to speak up. This thought accompanied me for years, as if my feelings needed justification to exist. Childhood was not marked by major visible traumas, and perhaps that is why it was so easy to normalize what I see more clearly today. It was all subtle, almost polite. But the silence was constant, heavy, disciplinary. He taught without having to raise his voice. And I, wanting to be accepted, quickly learned the rules of this silent game. Today, when I mentally returned to that house, I realized that it was there that my voice began to shrink. Not by a single episode, but by repetition. Day after day, gesture after gesture, I came to understand that talking too much was not safe. And so, even before I grew up, I was already learning to disappear a little to fit better in that space. As a child, I realized that asking questions was not always welcome. These were not mean questions, just the natural curiosity of those trying to understand the world around them. But it was enough to insist a little more to feel the atmosphere change. A heavier sigh, a steady gaze, a silence that said everything without needing words. Gradually, I learned that questioning meant crossing an invisible limit that should not be crossed. There were small situations that repeated themselves and taught me this lesson constantly. When I asked why a decision was made, the answer came short or none. When I showed discomfort, someone said I was exaggerating or being ungrateful. Nothing was said aggressively, but the message was clear: don't complicate, don't insist, don't talk too much. I absorbed all of this in silence, trying to adjust. Over time, I began to anticipate the reactions of others. Even before I opened my mouth, I was already evaluating whether it was worth talking. Most of the time, I concluded that it was not. It was safer to agree, bow your head, and move on. This strategy gave me a false sense of control, as if conflict avoidance was a form of personal protection. I didn't realize that I was, in fact, giving up on myself. I also learned to observe more than to participate. I paid attention to the gestures, the tones of voice, the moments when the silence became denser. That helped me know when to disappear a little. Being discreet has become a skill, almost a talent. People praised my calm manner, not knowing that this tranquility had been built on the fear of displeasing me. This early learning shaped the way I began to relate to the world. I grew up believing that my opinion had less value than that of others. That my doubts were a nuisance. That my emotions needed to be contained. It was as if I had learned a fundamental rule of life: being quiet is safer than being truthful. Today, looking at this girl I feel a mixture of sadness and understanding. She didn't know how to do it differently. Questioning seemed too dangerous for someone who just wanted to belong. And so, without realizing it, I carried this behavior into adulthood, thinking that silence was wisdom, when in fact it was just survival. I remember that day with a clarity that still haunts me. It wasn't a big event for those who look at it from the outside, but inside me something broke definitively. I was still young, full of doubts and trying to understand my place in the world, when I realized that I had crossed an invisible line. Something happened, something that left me confused, uncomfortable, not knowing exactly how to react. And it was precisely at that moment that the words that changed everything came. There were no screams or dramatic scenes. It was said in a firm, almost calm tone, as if it were wise advice. They said I needed to be quiet, that talking would only bring problems, that no one needed to know, that it was better for everyone if it was forgotten. They used phrases that sounded responsible, almost protective, but that carried enormous weight. I felt, at that moment, that my version of the facts did not matter. What struck me the most was not only the request for silence, but the way it was normalized. They spoke as if it were something ordinary, as if I was exaggerating when I felt what I felt. They said I needed to be strong, think about my family, about the future. At no time did they ask me how I was or what it had done to me. The message was clear: my discomfort was an inconvenient detail. That day, I learned that there were subjects that should not be touched upon, even if they hurt. I learned that the responsibility of keeping the peace would fall on me. And, more than that, I learned to feel ashamed for something I couldn't even explain properly. I left that conversation smaller than I entered, carrying a guilt that I couldn't name, but that started to accompany me silently. For a long time, I repeated to myself that it had been the best thing to do. That obeying had prevented something worse. I tried to believe that being silent was a sign of maturity, of emotional intelligence. But, deep down, something inside me knew that silence had too high a cost. Still, I kept going, because there seemed to be no other possible choice at that moment. Today, so many years later, I understand that was the exact point at which my life took another turn. Not because of what happened, but because of the silence that came after. It was there that I learned to swallow whole truths to fit the expectations of others. And this learning accompanied me for decades, shaping decisions, relationships, and the way I came to see myself. The words spoken that day were not many, but they stuck in me as if they had been forcibly engraved. There was no discussion, no room for response. It was a direct, firm speech, ending any possibility of dialogue. I remember being silent, not because I agreed, but because I understood that it was not a request. It was an instruction, and I felt it in my body before I even understood it with my head. It's better not to talk about it. This phrase accompanied me for years. It came up whenever I thought about bringing it up, whenever the memory came back with more force. I repeated these words to myself as if they were a universal rule, something I needed to obey to avoid greater consequences. At that moment, obeying seemed the only way to continue. Another phrase that never left my memory was said with an almost careful tone, "No one needs to know." That sounded like protection, but it soon turned into weight. Because if no one needed to know, then what I felt didn't need to be considered either. Gradually, I began to understand that silence was not my choice, it was an expectation placed on me. There was also the idea that talking would only bring problems. This phrase was especially powerful, because it made me associate my voice with chaos. I came to believe that opening my mouth could destroy something important, that I would be responsible for any negative consequences. This fear has quietly followed me, shaping my attitudes for decades. Most confusing of all was the tone of normality with which these words were spoken. There was no real concern for me, only what might happen if I spoke up. No one asked how I was feeling or if I needed help. The conversation ended quickly, as if the matter was resolved only because it was silenced. Over time, I realized that these words became a kind of echo inside me. Whenever I felt like expressing myself, something stopped me inside. It was as if I was still in that room, hearing again that it was better to be quiet. Even when no one else was present, silence continued to be imposed. These phrases were not stuck only to that episode. They spread throughout my life. I began to use them to justify my own omission, as if they were wise advice that I should follow. I told myself that it was not worth talking about, that it was better to let it go, that time would solve everything. The problem is that time has not solved it. He just pushed everything in, accumulating feelings that never found a way out. The more I repeated those words, the more distant I became from myself. My voice grew lower and lower, until it almost disappeared completely. Today, when I remember these phrases, I can see them more clearly. They were not neutral, nor careful. They were convenient. Convenient to keep everything as it was, to avoid discomfort, to preserve appearances. Acknowledging this does not erase the past, but it changes the way I see myself within it. Naming these words, after so long, is painful, but necessary. Because as long as they remain nameless, they continue to have power. And I've spent too many years allowing sentences spoken in a single day to rule the rest of my life in silence. After that day, pretending everything was fine became a skill I've honed over the years. It was not something planned, but a silent adaptation. I woke up, fulfilled my obligations and followed the routine as if nothing had happened. On the outside, my life kept moving. Inside, I learned to push everything into a corner where I didn't have to look straight ahead. At first, pretending seemed temporary. I thought that, over time, things would lose importance, that emotions would calm down on their own. I really believed that. So I smiled when they asked if everything was okay and answered yes, even when I felt a constant knot in my chest. It was easier to sustain this answer than to explain something that even I couldn't organize. Over the years, this pretense ceased to be conscious. I no longer woke up thinking I was hiding something. It was simply part of me. I behaved like someone calm, balanced, who doesn't get shaken easily. People trusted this image, praised my calmness, without imagining the effort that existed behind it. I avoided situations that could put me in conflict. I preferred to give in, agree or be silent than to have to deal with discomfort. It gave me a momentary sense of security, as if I was in control. But this control was always accompanied by a deep tiredness, a wear and tear that I could not explain properly. There were days when I felt like talking, sharing the weight I carried. But soon came the automatic thought that it would not be worth it. I convinced myself that no one would understand, that it was a thing of the past, that I should be grateful for what I had. Thus, I myself invalidated my feelings before they gained a voice. This pretense also affected the way I saw myself. I came to believe that being strong meant not showing pain. What maturity it was to swallow discomfort and move on without complaining. I confused resistance with emotional health, not realizing that I was just accumulating unresolved things inside me. In many moments, I felt a growing distance between who I was on the inside and who I showed on the outside. It was like living two versions of myself: an obedient, functional, admired one; another tired, confused, full of questions that were never asked. This silent division accompanied me for a long time. Even in happy moments, there was something that didn't quite fit. I smiled, celebrated, participated, but always with a part of me watching from afar. As if I was never whole anywhere. This emptiness had no name, but it was always present, silent and persistent. Pretending that everything was fine also took me away from my own intuition. Whenever something bothered me, I doubted myself. I thought it was exaggeration, too sensitive, something in my head. Gradually, I unlearned to trust what I felt. Today, looking back, I understand that pretending was the way I found to survive in that context. I don't blame myself for that anymore. I did what I knew, with the tools I had. But acknowledging that I've lived so long faking it is painful, because it means admitting how far I've strayed from myself to keep everything seemingly in order. I got married believing that I was doing what was expected of me. There were no great doubts or deep questions, just the feeling of following the right path. They said that this was how life progressed, that after marriage everything would be organized. I entered this phase carrying with me the silence that was already part of who I was, without realizing how much it would influence my choices. At first, everything seemed normal. There was routine, commitments, shared responsibilities. I strove to be a good wife, someone who was understanding, patient, and did not create unnecessary conflict. I always thought that relationships required compromises, and I was already an expert on that. Giving in came naturally, almost automatically, as if it were my main way of contributing. When the children arrived, my attention turned entirely to them. Being a mom gave me a clear purpose and a sense of usefulness that I didn't feel before. I dedicated myself completely, trying to do everything right, protecting, caring, anticipating needs. Deep down, I believed that by taking good care of others, I would find some kind of inner balance. But even in that role, silence was still present. I avoided showing tiredness, fear, or insecurity. I thought I needed to be strong all the time, especially for my children. I didn't want them to notice any fragility in me. So I kept accumulating unspoken feelings, believing that this was part of the responsibility of being an adult. Life took its course, and to those looking from the outside, everything seemed to work. There was a structured family, commitments fulfilled, a predictable routine. I myself repeated to myself that I was lucky, that I had no reason to complain. This constant comparison with worse situations helped me justify the discomfort I felt, as if it were not valid. In many moments, I felt a kind of emptiness that I could not explain. Even surrounded by people, there was a silent loneliness. I wondered if it was normal to feel that, but soon I pushed the thought away. There was always something more urgent to do, someone needing me. And so, I postponed any closer look inside. The silence also influenced how I resolved conflicts within the marriage. Instead of talking, I swallowed. Instead of exposing discomfort, I adapted. I thought that this was maturity, that avoiding arguments was a sign of emotional intelligence. I didn't realize that by doing this, I was once again putting myself on the back burner. Over the years, this behavior became so natural that I no longer knew how to act otherwise. I prided myself on being someone who was easy to deal with, who didn't demand much. This pride, I see today, came from a place of fear. Fear of displeasing, of losing, of causing ruptures that I wouldn't know how to fix. Even in the happy moments, there was something contained in me. I smiled, celebrated, participated, but always with an internal reserve. As if I was half present. This feeling accompanied me throughout my adult life, silent, constant, difficult to explain even to myself. I believed that this was just the price of ordinary life, that everyone felt something similar, but didn't speak. So I kept going, day after day, fulfilling my role, keeping everything running. Without realizing that, by calling this normal, I was once again validating a silence that had already cost me too much. Today, revisiting this phase, I can see how much that common life was built on invisible renunciations. Nothing seemed wrong enough to be questioned, but everything required me to remain silent. And this pattern, which seemed so natural, was only deepening, setting the stage for consequences that I didn't yet understand at that moment. Over the years, I began to feel a tiredness that didn't seem to come only from the body. It was a silent weight, hard to explain, as if I was carrying something invisible all the time. No matter how much I rested or how many obligations I fulfilled, that feeling remained. I woke up already tired, as if I had never really been allowed to rest fully. This weight had no clear cause, and perhaps that is why it was so easy to ignore it. I couldn't pinpoint a specific reason for feeling this way, so I concluded that it was just part of life. I told myself that everyone felt tired sometimes, that it was normal. Once again, I normalized something that was slowly consuming me. In many moments, I felt constant guilt, even without knowing exactly why. It was as if I was always owing someone something. If something didn't go as expected, I immediately thought it was my fault. This silent guilt accompanied me in decisions small and large, shaping my reactions and keeping me always alert, always too careful. There was also an emotional confusion that was difficult to name. I didn't know exactly what I felt, only that something wasn't in place. Sometimes it was sadness, sometimes irritation, sometimes just a formless emptiness. Since I never learned to talk about emotions, I also didn't learn to recognize them clearly. Everything was mixed, stored, with no room for organization. This invisible weight began to influence my health in subtle ways. It was not something that could be easily explained, but I felt in my body what never came out of my mouth. A constant squeeze, a lack of energy, a feeling of always being on edge. Still, I kept going, because stopping to look at it seemed too dangerous. I continued to fulfill my responsibilities, but each task required more effort than before. What once seemed simple began to tire me deeply. Even so, I didn't speak. I thought that complaining would be exaggerated, that I needed to be stronger, more grateful, more resistant. Silence continued to be my automatic response. There were days when I silently wondered when I had started to feel this way. But soon he pushed the thought away. Looking inside still seemed forbidden, as if messing with these things could destabilize everything. So I pushed it back again and kept working. This constant functioning took me away from simple joy. I participated in happy moments, but always with a sense of distance. As if something was preventing me from being whole there. I smiled, but inside there was an old, accumulated tiredness that had never found true rest. The hardest thing was to realize that no one seemed to notice. For the others, I was still the same as always, responsible, calm, present. This reinforced the idea that the problem was only with me. If no one saw it, then maybe it wasn't real. This constant doubt kept me stuck for a long time. Today, as I look back, I understand that that invisible weight was the result of years of swallowing what needed to be said. It was not weakness, nor lack of gratitude. It was a consequence. Consequence of a life lived in silence, where my pains never had space to exist out loud. As time went on, I began to notice that my body reacted in a way that I couldn't explain. It wasn't a specific pain, nor something constant enough to get immediate attention. It was a deep, silent tiredness, which accompanied me even on the quietest days. I told myself that it was a matter of age, routine, life full of responsibilities. There were mornings when I woke up already exhausted, as if I hadn't really rested. The body felt heavy, slow, and each movement required more effort than it should. Still, I got up and went about my day, because I always did. Complaining has never been a comfortable option for me. I began to live with small discomforts that appeared and disappeared without warning. Sometimes it was a constant tension, other times a feeling of tightness that was difficult to locate. I was looking for practical explanations, something physical, something simple. It never occurred to me that it could have anything to do with everything I had been carrying in silence for so many years. I cared for everyone around me with attention, but I rarely directed that care to myself. There was always someone in need more, some more urgent situation. My body gave signals, but I treated them as nuisances to be managed, not as messages to be listened to. At times, I even thought I was getting weak. I compared myself to other people my age and wondered why I felt so tired. This comparison only increased my guilt, as if I was failing once again, even without knowing exactly what. What I didn't understand at that time is that my body was reacting to what my voice never said. He was carrying the weight of the swallowed words, the contained emotions, the situations that were never worked out. It was a silent but insistent form of expression. Even so, I avoided any deeper reflection. Looking at it would mean facing memories and feelings that I had spent my entire life avoiding. I was afraid that messing with these things would disorganize everything I had built with so much effort. Over time, I began to accept that state as something normal. He said that my body was like that I needed to get used to it. This acceptance did not come from peace, it came from resignation. I was already used to swallowing feelings, so swallowing my own tiredness seemed like just another obligation. Today, looking back, I realize how patient my body was with me. He tried to warn in every possible way, while I insisted on not listening. It was not an exaggeration, nor weakness. It was the consequence of a lifetime lived in silence. Understanding this now is painful, but also enlightening. My body has never been against me. He just carried what I didn't have the courage to put into words. And acknowledging this helps me understand why, after so many years, being silent began to hurt more than any physical discomfort. The awakening did not come as an immediate shock, nor as a great dramatic revelation. It began quietly, almost shyly, at a time that seemed too ordinary to carry so much meaning. I was already older, with life slowing down, when I realized that certain questions began to linger inside me. Questions that I had always pushed away now came back with more force, as if they knew that I no longer had as much energy to continue running away from them. It was a simple conversation that opened this gap. Someone younger asked me something direct, bluntly, and I felt an immediate discomfort. Before I even answered, I realized that my first reaction was to teach the same silence I learned. Tell them not to talk, to leave them alone, not to touch what could cause discomfort. It hit me in an unexpected way, because for the first time I found myself repeating exactly what they did to me. After that moment, something changed inside me. It was not immediate, but it was irreversible. I began to observe my own responses, my advice, my reactions. I realized how much I still carried those invisible rules, even after so many years. The silence that was imposed on me was not in the past. He was alive, being passed on, almost automatically, without me noticing. This realization caused me deep discomfort. I spent nights awake thinking about it, reliving old situations from a new perspective. Things that once seemed normal began to take on another meaning. Phrases that I have always accepted without question have come to sound different. For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility that I wasn't wrong for feeling the way I did. The hardest thing was to accept that it had never been my fault. This idea, which seems simple when said out loud, took decades to form inside me. I was taught to take on responsibilities that weren't mine, to carry weights that didn't belong to me. Understanding this was painful, because it meant recognizing how unfair I had been to myself throughout my life. This belated awakening was not accompanied by immediate anger. It came with sadness, a calm, deep, almost silent sadness. Sadness for the lost time, for the words never spoken, for the choices made from fear. But it also came with something new, clarity. A clarity that I had never allowed to exist before. I began to understand that the silence I was taught was not neutrality. He always had a side, he always benefited someone, he always had a function. And this function was never to protect me. Recognizing this was like taking an old weight off your chest, even if it left a temporary void in place. I also realized that I didn't need proof, validations, or authorizations to acknowledge my own history. I spent my whole life waiting for someone to say that I was right to feel what I felt. At that moment, I understood that this permission needed to come from me. And that was scary, but also liberating. The awakening was accompanied by fear. Fear of speaking too late, fear of not being taken seriously, fear of disorganizing relationships that I have maintained with so much effort. But for the first time, this fear was not enough to silence me completely. He existed, but he no longer ruled me as before. I began to accept that time does not come back, but consciousness arrives when it can. And maybe there is no right time to wake up, only the possible time. This thought brought me a strange peace, mixed with pain, but necessary to move forward. It was at this point in my life that I understood something fundamental. Being silent no longer protected me. On the contrary, I kept hurting myself. And this perception, even if late, was the beginning of something new. Not a life without marks, but a more honest life with myself. This part that comes now is the most difficult to share. Talking about it means giving up the silence that protected me for decades, even knowing how much it still hurts. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths are too expensive to keep. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture of preservation, so that voices like this are not pushed back into silence. The truth didn't come to me as a clear explanation from someone. No one sat me down to say that I wasn't to blame, that I wasn't exaggerated, that my silence was never a free choice. This truth was slowly forming inside me, like something that had always been there, but that I didn't have the courage to face. It was a silent process, made up of memories that began to reorganize themselves in a different way. For a long time, I believed that there was something wrong with me. That I felt too much, thought too much, affected me too much. This idea was so repeated throughout my life that it became an absolute truth within me. Only now, as an old woman, have I begun to question this. And this questioning was uncomfortable, because it messed with everything I used to keep myself standing for so many years. I began to look at my history with more distance, as if I were observing someone else's life. As I did so, I noticed patterns that I couldn't see before. I saw how much I was conditioned to take on responsibilities that were never mine. I saw how I was taught to carry emotional weights in silence, while others followed without ever having to explain themselves. This new reading of the past brought a strange mixture of relief and pain. Relief to finally understand that I wasn't wrong. Pain for realizing how long it took me to reach this conclusion. There were times when I felt like crying for the time that had passed, for the choices made from a guilt that should never have existed. The hardest truth to accept was that no one ever intended to explain this to me. Not because they were necessarily bad, but because silence was always more convenient. Keeping everything as it was easier than questioning old structures, unbalanced relationships, imposed expectations. And I was an important piece in this maintenance, precisely because I learned not to speak. Understanding this didn't bring me immediate anger. It brought sadness and a certain emotional fatigue. It was like realizing that I lived a large part of my life trying to correspond to rules that were never made to protect me. Rules that asked me for restraint, obedience, and understanding, but never offered me real space to exist fully. I also realized how hard I was on myself. How many times have I criticized myself for feeling what I felt? How many times have I invalidated myself even before anyone else did? I carried this harshness as if it were responsibility, when in fact it was just fear of taking up too much space. Recognizing this was one of the most painful moments of this process. Gradually, I came to understand that the truth that no one told me was simple, but powerful. I had the right to feel, to question, to speak, even if it caused discomfort, even if it wasn't well received. This right never ceased to exist, I just learned to ignore it in order to survive. This perception has not changed the past, but it has changed the way I relate to it. The memories did not disappear, but they lost some of the weight they carried. They ceased to be evidence against me and became parts of a larger, more complex, more human story. Today, I know that this truth did not come early, but it came at the possible time. Maybe I hadn't been able to see her before. Maybe it would be necessary to live everything I lived to get here. This idea does not erase the pain, but it brings an understanding that allows me to move forward with more kindness to myself. Accepting this truth was like opening a window after decades in a closed environment. The air is still strange, the body still adjusts, but something essential has changed. For the first time, I don't feel wrong for wanting to exist without silence. And that, even so late, makes all the difference. Speaking out after 40 years was not a sudden impulse or a heroic gesture. It was the result of a silent buildup that reached a limit impossible to ignore. For decades, I convinced myself that opening my mouth would only bring problems, that silence was the surest way to keep everything in order. But there came a time when this order began to suffocate me, and remaining silent began to hurt more than any imagined consequence. Before I could tell anyone, I had to admit to myself that I could no longer support that weight. There was something inside me asking for passage, insisting on existing. I tried to ignore it, as I did so many other times, but it didn't work. The words began to form on their own, even without a certain destination, as if my body and mind had finally made a deal. I spent a long time believing that speaking meant accusing, exposing, creating irreversible conflicts. This idea kept me paralyzed for years. Only later did I understand that this association was also part of the control I learned. Talking didn't have to be an attack. Speaking could be just telling my version, without the obligation to convince anyone, without demanding answers or reparations. The process of deciding to speak out was a lonely one. I rehearsed entire conversations in silence, imagined reactions, prepared answers that might never have been necessary. There were nights when I woke up with my heart racing, overcome by an old fear of being disauthorized, discredited, diminished. Even so, something inside me was still firm, as if to say that now there was no turning back. When I finally spoke, I didn't pick a big moment or make dramatic announcements. It was simple, almost shy, but loaded with a huge meaning for me. My voice came out shaky, my hands were sweating, and for a few seconds I thought about stopping. But I continued, because I realized that this discomfort was small compared to what I had already endured in silence for 40 years. As I spoke, I felt an intense mixture of relief and vulnerability. Relief for finally putting words where there has always been silence. Vulnerability for exposing myself without knowing how it would be received. There was no immediate reaction that would solve everything, and at that moment I understood that there might never be. Still, something essential had already changed within me. Some reactions were exactly as I feared. There were those who preferred not to listen, those who changed the subject, those who reacted with discomfort or disbelief. That hurt more than I care to admit. But for the first time, that pain didn't make me back down. I had already understood that speaking did not guarantee acceptance, but being silent certainly guaranteed the continuation of the imprisonment. There were also unexpected reactions. People who listened in silence, without trying to correct my memory, without minimizing my feelings. This kind of listening didn't erase the past, but it showed me that my voice had value. Even if it wasn't accepted by everyone, it wasn't wrong for existing. And that was profoundly transformative. After speaking, I felt a tiredness unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just physical, it was as if something very old had finally been moved. At the same time, I felt a strange, almost uncomfortable lightness, as if one had become so accustomed to the weight that it is strange when it decreases. I was learning to live differently. Speaking out after 40 years hasn't changed what happened, but it has changed who I am in relation to my own story. Silence is no longer an automatic obligation and has become a conscious choice. And this difference, in itself, was liberating. For the first time, I felt that my life belonged to me a little more. After I spoke, I quickly realized that telling the truth does not guarantee listening. I always knew this in theory, but experiencing it was different. Some people just didn't want to listen. Not because I was shouting or accusing, but because my speech threatened the silent order that had always existed. It was more comfortable to pretend that nothing had been said than to deal with what my words aroused. There were reactions that came in the form of absolute silence. Changes of subject, short answers, looks that avoided mine. This kind of reaction was especially difficult, because it exactly replicated the environment in which I was raised. It was as if the silence tried to impose itself again, now in a more subtle way, trying to push me back to the place I had always occupied. There were also those who reacted with visible discomfort. Restless, impatient people, as if I were saying something inconvenient, out of turn. At times, I felt that they saw me as someone who was reopening old things, as if time had the power to erase what was never resolved. These reactions made me question, for a moment, if I had done the right thing. Some answers came in the form of justifications. Attempts to explain, relativize, minimize. Sentences that began with, "At that time it was different," or "No one intended to hurt." Hearing this brought me deep sadness, because it was not an intention, but an effect. I wasn't apologizing or correcting myself, just acknowledging my experience. The most painful thing was to realize that some people preferred to protect their own image instead of listening to my story. It wasn't about me, but about what my speech represented. Accepting this was difficult, because for a long time I believed that if I spoke calmly and respectfully, I would be understood. I discovered that this is not always enough. Despite this, something inside me was different. The negative reactions did not paralyze me as before. They hurt, yes, but they didn't silence me again. For the first time, I was able to sustain my speech without needing the immediate approval of others. This posture was new to me and, at the same time, frightening and liberating. There were also times when I felt lonely after speaking. As if he had crossed a border without knowing exactly who would be on the other side. This loneliness was not the same as before. It was accompanied by awareness, not confusion. I knew why I was there and what had brought me to that point. I realized that not everyone is ready to hear truths they didn't choose to hear. Some people prefer the comfortable version of the story, even if it is incomplete. Understanding this helped me not to personalize the reactions so much. It was not a judgment about my worth, but about the limits of each one. Gradually, I came to accept that speaking is not an obligatory invitation to listen. It is a right. And the fact that someone does not want to listen does not invalidate what was said. This understanding gave me a quiet strength, different from the rigid strength I carried for so many years. I also learned that not every answer comes at the time. Some people need time, others will never react. And that's not in my control. What was under my control was the decision not to shut up again just to keep up appearances. At the end of this process, I understood something essential. Not everyone wanted to listen, but I finally heard myself. And that, after a lifetime of silence, was already a profound change. I no longer needed the silence of others to justify mine. My voice had found space within me, and no one could take that away. Today, when I look back at everything I've experienced, I no longer think in terms of sooner or later. For a long time, I tortured myself with the idea that I woke up too late, I spoke too late, I understood too late. But the truth is that I woke up when it was possible. Each phase of my life had the tools it could have, and demanding from me a lucidity that I could not achieve at that time only prolonged the same injustice that I experienced for years. I spent decades believing that time invalidated feelings. That if something was not said at the right time, it lost the right to exist. Today I understand how false this is. Time does not erase what has been experienced, it only teaches us to live with it in different ways. Some truths need maturity, distance, and courage to emerge. And these things often only come with age. Growing old has brought me losses, but it has also given me something precious, clarity. A clarity that does not come from haste, nor from the need to please. For the first time, I feel no urgency to convince anyone of my story. She's mine. I know her from the inside. That is enough for me in a way that has never been enough before. There is a new tranquility in not having to prove anything. If before I measured my life by what I managed to keep silent, today I measure it by what I had the courage to recognize. To recognize my pains, my limits, my choices made out of fear. It doesn't weaken me, it humanizes me. Understanding that I did what I could, with what I had, completely changes the way I look at my past. I'm not telling this story to rewrite it, nor to seek belated reparations. I'm telling you because talking gave me back something essential, presence. For a long time, I lived as if I was just fulfilling a role. Now, even with all the brands, I feel like I'm really here. Whole, conscious, less fragmented by silence. I also learned that silence is not always negative. It can be rest, choice, pause. The problem has never been the silence itself, but the imposed silence, the silence that erases, that shames, that isolates. Today, when I choose to be quiet, that choice belongs to me. It no longer comes from fear, it comes from consciousness. If someone younger hears this story, I hope they understand something important. Don't wait a lifetime to hear it. But if you expect it to happen, still, know that it's not too late. There is no expiration date for the inner truth. It can be said at 20, 50, or 70. Its value does not decrease over time. I also hope that those who have aged in silence will realize that they are not alone. Many lives have been shaped by the same logic: don't talk, don't question, don't complicate. Acknowledging this does not change what was, but it does change what can still be. And as long as there is awareness, there is the possibility of internal change. Today, I carry less guilt and more effective responsibility with myself. I no longer need to punish myself for what I didn't know how to do before. I can take care of who I am now. I can respect my limits, my history, my emotions. It doesn't make me bitter, it makes me honest. What I learned, at the end of it all, is simple and profound. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told. But even if they are said late, they still matter. They matter because they liberate, because they organize, because they restore dignity to history itself. And after 40 years of silence, that's more than enough to move on. If something about this story touched you, consider sharing it. Not as a simple gesture, but as a way to take this message to those who still live trapped in silences that hurt. Stories like this don't just talk about one person, but patterns that cross families and generations, and sharing them can be the first step to breaking that cycle. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching, and what about this story stayed with you? Your words matter more than you think, they reach me.